Okay, well, it's 12:03. I think we'll go ahead and start. Good afternoon. I'm Jim Shelton with 31st Street Swing Left. I want to thank our various co-hosts, great co-sponsors rather, who have contributed to this event. And first off, I just want to make it clear that this is really just about learning and information. It's not a fundraiser. It's not a event to try to do a lot of action items and that sort of thing. Although we do think that there are some ideas out here that could evolve into some good funding for organizations like ours down the line. And I also want to shout out to the Rural Democracy Initiative and to Force Multiplier, who actually are funding some activities in this area. So we're going to have three presentations in succession, and then we're going to have breakout groups where you can choose which one you can go to and drill down a little bit more on what you want to hear about. We request that you, in the plenary part, that you do put questions in the chat. We probably will not get to them, all of them, at least in interest of time during the plenary, but it'll provide some fodder, some ammunition for some things that might be discussed in the breakouts as well. And I hope that the presenters, if they can, will take some note of some of those questions as well. So we don't like to do long introductions because we want to get to the meat. And I'm just going to rattle off the names of our great presenters and their titles and their organizations, and then we'll move on. So we're starting with Fraser Nelson, who is the Chief Partnership Officer for the National Trust for Local News. And then Kate Bassett, National Political Director, Courier News. And then last, we do have Greg Meyer, who's a North Carolina state senator, just finished voting on horrible gerrymandering going on in that state, but he's the publisher of Beacon Media. He may be called away for another vote. And if he is, his very competent partner, Jeremy Borden, will fill in for him. So with that, we'll just turn it over to you, Fraser.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to also give a shout out to the Rural Democracy Initiative, which has been a great supporter of the National Trust for Local News. So the Trust has been around for a little more than 2 years, and our mission is to conserve traditional newspapers, primarily in rural communities. I think we've got some slides that are going to come up, but if not, we can get those later. What we do is we try to keep local news in local hands. And like you all, we really think that local news is a critical part, a really fundamental part of our democracy. Next slide, please. I know that you all have heard a lot about the loss of local newspapers, but what's hardly ever looked at is where the impact really is in the United States. These are the areas of the country that have the greatest risk of becoming news deserts. And you can see that the Southeast, where many of you are living, is a place that has the greatest risk of people going without local news. And by local news, we really mean newspapers, primarily weeklies, that are in counties where if that source of news goes away, there's really no replica. There's no other source of local news. There might be a radio station. Certainly people can listen to National Public Radio, but there is no direct local source of news. And so that's 45 million people in this country. Again, many of them in the Southeast of the United States. Next. So we're the only organization, at least that we're aware of, that are actually acquiring local newspapers. We acquire these papers and we operate them. You can kind of think of us as a land trust movement, but for news. So we conserve these papers like you conserve, land, and then we work to, after our acquisition, to transform them so that they're able to become more financially sustainable. By moving a group of single owners into one nonprofit organization, we can share a lot of back office services. And of course, we can bring to bear a lot of technology and other things that would not be accessible to, a family that's living in a rural area that's owned a newspaper for 5 generations and is just on print, etc. So we really try to modernize these products. And we also try to make sure that they are reinvigorated with new reporting. Oftentimes these papers have really been starved. So we bring resources that are able to increase the editorial content of the paper. Next. We've only been around for a short time, but we are already the 5th largest independent newspaper operator in the country. Next slide. And we want to be everywhere in the United States. Right now, we operate 63 newspapers. You might have read our recent acquisition in Maine, where we bought 22 newspapers. We have quite a few journalists under our employment and over 500 employees total. And that includes union workers that are running presses, etc. Our work is serving about 5.8 million people. Our next expansion plans are in Kentucky, Montana, and New Mexico. We're currently in Colorado, Georgia, and Maine. Next. So as I said, what we do basically is we conserve these papers. That's step 1, make sure they don't shut down. Then we help transform them, partnerships with other organizations, including HBCUs and others that can bring young and diverse talent to newspapers. And then we work to make sure that they're financially sustainable for the long term. Next. And really by having this national infrastructure, we can help really bring, I think, quite a bit of both talent and also resources to these papers so that they have a new lease on life, so to speak. And we work really hard to make sure that we are not forever dependent on philanthropy. These are businesses. The companies we own have over, probably near $50 million in revenue every year. These are companies that we think can be self-sustaining for the long term. Philanthropy is primarily used in the acquisition and transformation piece. Next. And that's it. So looking forward to hearing from my other compatriots and to meeting with you in the breakout rooms. Thank you.
Terrific. Okay, so let's shift over to Kate then.
Hi, everyone. Fraser, I just have to say thank you so much for the work you do. I was a local weekly rural newspaper editor for 22 years and have the good fortune of our paper being, still in existence, still family owned and still thriving. But it's so essential. And I'm really excited to see Greg and Jeremy on this call as well, because we are able to collaborate and get up to some good trouble together. And shout out to RDI for doing all the great things, because they also support our work at Courier. I think we have some slides coming, but if not, I can just talk at you all too. That's no problem. So many of you on this call have heard from Tara McGowan, the CEO and founder of Courier in the past. So I'm going to do a very fast overview, kind of what we do. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so we are currently in 9 states that you see here. We are launching in New Hampshire next month and in Texas in December. We are a digital social first B Corp, so public benefit corporation news network with local newsrooms in all of these states, where we have at least 3 to 5 local reporters working every single day to connect the dots, often between policymakers and everyday impact, but also to build community through content that is just relevant, fun, essential lifestyle stuff. We target what we call passive news consumers, which are people who either live in news deserts, as you heard Fraser say. So many of our papers of record have closed over time, or they are folks who just are not getting paywalled news at all. They might be tuning out in general from traditional news sources, and they are getting most of their information as they scroll their social media feeds, which everyone on this call knows can be a mis and disinformation dumpster fire. Next slide. So obviously, like I said, we reach the folks who are otherwise not being reached by traditional news sources. And we know that, up to 50% of Americans are getting news from social media on a daily basis. Go next slide. So just a little bit of info about us. So we have 1.73 million online subscribers. 239,000 of those are TikTok followers. Most of those are in the Gen Z generational age range. And then we have 550,000 email subscribers across our network. Just in the last quarter, our reporters produced 20,000 pieces of original content. It's a lot because it's social and we have to flood the zone. We had like 9.3 million engagements and more than 40 million monthly impressions a month. Okay. Okay, so how do we do what we do? Just again, we bring in most of our subscribers through community and lifestyle content. We want to build trust with people. We want to be a resource. We want to develop relationships. A lot of what we do is just fun things to do with your family, free things, things that celebrate a state's sense of place, things that have nothing to do with civic education content at all, because that's not necessarily what our audience is looking for. So our community and lifestyle content is what organically grows our email subscriber base in particular, and also opens the door to two-way conversations. Our community reporters work very hard to develop authentic relationships with our subscribers, so they are always doing call and response kinds of stories and questions and conversations, particularly with email subscribers, so that they feel invested in the work that we are reporting. Okay, next slide. Okay, and then our political side, our civic engagement side, our sort of rule for local reporters is to show up and to be present for all of the most salient moments in state legislative and, you know, like federal implementation at a state level moments. So you'll see here, these are just some examples of recent TikTok coverage that we did with our reporters. So they are on the ground in rallies, in moments, but not just in moments. They know to look for the humanizing stuff. They know to stay longer than the sort of press scrum typically stays, so that they can get the kind of content that will get pickup and spread. Particularly, again, we're seeing a ton of movement on TikTok, where there still remains kind of a traditional news desert in general. Next slide. So the other thing that we really try and do on the civic education side is we meet with electeds in all of our states to really try to bring out the human side. So many of our audience members have told us directly that they feel really disconnected from politics because they don't trust politicians, because they feel all the same, because the hyper-partisan wars that are happening in our communities and in our states and in our country just frankly turn folks off. So a lot of the work that we do with elected officials, with our reporters' time, is not necessarily those hard-hitting policy pieces that traditional media really does need to cover. We try and bring out the human-centered and the human, you know, feelings and emotions. We did this really great interview in Michigan with Governor Gretchen Whitmer, 52 questions for her 52nd birthday. It had over 3 million views and something like 60,000, I think, comments and engagements. She was really happy with it because of that. You see Aaron Ford, the Attorney General in Nevada, and of course, Governor Shapiro in Pennsylvania actually reached out asking us to do interviews. We are starting to see this more and more with just state legislative officials as well, because they understand the value of being seen as people. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what's a relevant value to the sort of general ecosystem and the kind of left-leaning pro-democracy world about our news? You know, it's important to note our news are, you know, our journalists are real, true journalists. They win press awards. And also we recognize that because there is such a flood of mis and disinformation in digital spaces, we have to be able to provide content for other people to leverage. So that can look like elected officials, that can look like grassroots organizations and mission-aligned groups. And at the top, you'll see in those GIFs, it can look like content creators who are becoming an increasingly important source of trusted messengers across the platforms. They need good information that they can leverage and share with their trusted audiences. But they have to know that their state has a newsroom like ours available, which is where our content organizing department comes in. You can go to the next slide. So we understand that in order for essential and relevant information to break through the algorithm, we cannot trust anymore that just good reporting is enough. Everything is so flooded in the social media spaces that we have to go to people, meet people where they are. And we do this at Courier through some innovative work, developing partnerships with grassroots groups, mission-aligned organizations that really become ambassadors for good information and help share and teach their own volunteer forces how to share high-quality content, not just from our newsrooms, but other news and media sources in their state, and also by building a network of content creators that leverage our newsrooms as source material. Next slide. Okay, so our theory of change really is founded in the fact that we understand that trust from information at social media is at the highest level it ever has been, and trust in national news is at the lowest level it has been. This is really important because if we don't have high quality, good information flooding the zone on social media, when people's trust in what they see is at an all-time high, we run the risk of bad actors being the only voices. We also understand that in Gen Z, the critical block of voting population to be civically engaged and to step up and to, make sure that we protect democracy and freedom for the future. 55% of TikTok and Snapchat users, 52% of Instagram users get their news from personalities versus mainstream journalists. So we also understand that, we will always continue to invest in journalists and celebrate and support media organizations doing that. We also have to do the both and of making sure that we are developing communities of content creators that are sharing good, relevant information. Next slide. Okay, so how does content organizing really work? We build community and lift voices and amplify information. So network-wide, our department is on track to have nearly 200 grassroots and mission-aligned organizations actively sharing our newsroom content on a daily and weekly basis. And what that looks like for us as a media company, it's increased our engagement by nearly 10% per post on our civic education content. And our average reach is up by more than 6%. I think that this slide says, although I can't quite read the way it came out, our political content has been shared, I think, more than 40,000 pieces, like in different places this year so far. And our community content has been shared several 100,000 times across flooding the zones. So what this looks like in practice, we work with great organizations like Down Home North Carolina that did such a good job sharing content out of North Carolina, our newsroom there, Cardinal and Pine, but also we find it very, very important to give voice to our organizational partners. So we make sure that we are always lifting up op-eds and opportunities to lift the voices that may not otherwise be being heard, particularly in news deserts or in places where having those editorial voices is much more difficult as newspapers sort of shrink and conglomerates happen. Next slide. Okay, so in 2022, we piloted a program in Pennsylvania who used Keystone Newsroom, that's our Pennsylvania newsroom's content as source material that they were creating for TikTok and Instagram. And we did this around reproductive freedom and our content stories. We were looking for content creators who were talking about this a lot based in Pennsylvania, and we offered to share our news with them. We did a collaboration. We saw a 5% increase in click-through rates for news stories that were linked directly from those content creators. So they were sharing on their own platforms. They are influencers who have built trusted audiences within a state that we're talking about. And their collective audience was more than 250,000. So we saw really positive success with this. So we spent 2023 really thinking about and honing what this would look like moving forward for us. Next slide. So I just wanted to highlight, because we're probably a lot of us on this call are thinking about Virginia right now. One of the programs that we piloted in Virginia this year was to really build out influencer and video correspondent programs for Dogwood, our Virginia newsroom. So these are just some examples of some of the folks that we leveraged. And we did both community content to kind of bring people in the door and just straight political content. And you can go to the next slide, which just shows a little bit about what we saw. So we saw a 69% increase in impressions once we started leveraging these content creator programs. We saw a 7% increase in shares and saves on political content. We saw a 72% increase in full video views. Why this matters, of course, is because as people are scrolling through social media, you all have done that. You might stop on a video for 3 seconds and keep going. We really want people to be watching in full because that means they are invested. And we saw an 18% increase in engagement overall. Next slide. Okay, so just in general, what do trusted messengers do in terms of Courier and how they help the ecosystem? So we work really closely with content creators. We are now focused primarily on folks who have owned audiences of 10,000 or less. These would be considered micro influencers. And we focus on people who are state-based. Like the number one person right there is Liz from Iowa. She is our Iowa video correspondent, and she is an influencer in her own right. We develop these folks not only to be influencers talking to their owned audiences, but also video correspondents for us. And when they are correspondents for us, they are often breaking down news stories that our journalists have written for an audience that is more likely to be paying attention to a short form video. But we also build community with these people. We have a growing number of content creators. I think we are up to 22. We are on track to be at 38 by the end of this year. And we have monthly briefings with these folks where we skill build, we idea share, and we bring them briefings because we really want them to understand the important role that they play in spreading good information to their audiences, and also to empower them to be able to make content and to look for good information and resources, which kind of leads me to number 3. We do a lot of work to help our content creators source from other local media sources. We really do believe in lifting up the local news, particularly the traditional local news networks that are making forays for the first time into digital and social. I think Fraser touched on that. We understand that it's really important to support and see success in this model. So we do everything we can to have our content creators sharing that kind of content, and they of course tag back to those media sources as well. So that's just a little bit about content creating and content organizing here at Courier. And I think I get to pitch it over to Greg if he is not back on the floor.
Well, I'm going to jump in just ahead because this is so fascinating about the way you go about this. But I also just wanted to say that we weren't getting much action in the chat, so I had to put a question in myself. So I just want to encourage other people to put some questions in the chat to get the ball rolling on that. But with that, I will turn it over to Greg.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks to 31st Street for having us here. We appreciate all the support that you all have provided to North Carolina over the years and your interest in Beacon Media. And this is such a great way to look at how we're thinking about new media ecosystems with Fraser and Kate. Fraser's work on local papers directly overlaps with what we're doing, and Kate's emphasis on who are actually the interpreters of the news these days and who actually move people to think about what they do around policy is related to Beacon. So if you can bring up our slides, we'll give people a Beacon introduction to what we're doing. Beacon Media is an effort to try and overcome some of the things that have frustrated me in my 10 years in the state legislature. And we can go on to the next slide. North Carolina has always had the reputation of being the beacon of the South. That's where the name comes from. One of the states in the South that has held progressive ideals out for ourselves, and at times been ahead of the rest of the South. And we believe we can be again. We can move to the next slide. In order to do that, we have to have new leaders who are able to bring a new vision for what we can be, but also figure out new mechanisms for how we get those voices beyond existing media bubbles. Next slide, please. And as you've heard from Fraser specifically about local news deserts, we know that across North Carolina, when you get outside of the major metropolitan areas, we do have what are considered to be news deserts, but they're not completely vacant. What you largely have is you have rural communities and small ex-urban communities that have under-resourced local media. They have small weekly newspapers that maybe employ 1 or 2 people and use as much free content as they can and sell as much local advertising as they can, and they're barely staying alive. And then you have local independent radio stations that also struggle to keep on the airwaves because it's hard to have enough money to create local content. Maybe they buy some syndicated shows, maybe they use volunteers, but they are still trying to stay out there. And what we want to do is to utilize those existing local resources rather than creating new ones in order to distribute commentary and opinion that we think has the chance to impact the way that people think about policy and ultimately maybe how they think about elections. Next slide, please. The right already does this. If you look at our small local papers, you can see here a selection of headlines, most of them including the conservative North Carolina columnist John Hood. And so these local papers are already publishing on page 3 or 5, wherever their op-ed page is, they're already publishing conservative commentary every single week because the right is syndicating this content to them and helping them fill up column inches. And no one on the left is doing that. And so that's what we want to do. Next slide, please. Our belief is that we can be a pro-democracy media syndicate. Think about that old-fashioned idea of a syndicate like the Associated Press that doesn't actually own the presses, but that syndicates the contents of the presses. We want to do this for both radio and newspapers, and we want to do it in both English and Spanish, and to target communities that we know are interested in thinking about bold and positive ideas, but are being neglected right now. So that includes folks who would be rural Black folks, Spanish speakers, whether they're urban or rural, folks who are immigrants and are looking for local news to understand what's happening in their local area, not just national news, but also just folks that are in underserved media communities, especially where they don't hear state and local commentary. They only hear federal voices that are focused on congressional or presidential or other federal topics. Next slide, please. And so when we are out there and we're producing, whether it's a radio show or newspaper columns, what we want to do is to have new leaders who can really change the dialogue by not just being about politicians or politics themselves, but talking about ideas and coming from a values-based perspective. We're very interested in how do we push things like the winning jobs narrative or the factory towns type of language that's been used in Pennsylvania, and how do we start from places that is really based in values framing rather than trying to win people over by telling them that we have the best argument, but really how are we connecting to them? Next slide, please. This is kind of our theory of change. So if we can generate people who are new guests on radio shows or new hosts, or if we can generate people who are new columnists, and we can put them into the traditional media, the primary impact that we have here is community influencers. Think about who reads the op-ed page. It's not actually the majority of readers of a newspaper. Who listens to political talk radio? It's not everybody in the community. There's going to be way more people listening to pop radio or music. But the people who do listen to those types of shows or read the op-ed page in a paper are the influencers who use their social connections to impact who are going to be our leaders on policy, whether those are people that you're voting for or people who just have the power to work on policy in local communities. And therefore, those community influencers have the ability to make sure that the ideas and the leadership that we want to promote are getting connected to folks who are in media neglected communities. And if we can get more of those folks to tune in because we're presenting a different set of voices and perspectives, then that's great too. But we are well aware that, say, in rural Caswell County, where I represent, where the newspaper publishes 4,000 copies a week, and I don't even know how they get rid of 4,000 copies. Like, they must give a heck of a lot away at the library, or maybe there's several hundred people reading each week because they want to read about their kids' high school volleyball game, and that's why they picked up the paper that week. But if we can get even 300 or 400 people a week to read a column with a perspective that comes from the left rather than the right, then we're changing the dialogue in that small community. Next slide, please. All right, yeah, I already talked about this one. Let's keep going. And then, so just where will this be? I mean, I've mentioned this in general, but the work that we have to do next as our part of our stand-up is we have to go beyond kind of the broad media mapping to actually sit down with folks at radio stations, local newspapers, and figure out how much content they want and what content. We're working on developing radio shows. We met with a rural newspaper earlier this week and got them to commit to taking 2 columns a month. And so we are finding that people who are, even like the newspaper we met with is a newspaper that publishes almost completely conservative perspective, both on their op-ed page and in the syndicated news that they take. But they really just need content, and they do want some semblance of balanced opinion. So getting them to agree to take on a couple of columns a month wasn't very hard. And then we're going to also be working with community-based organizations to figure out what, beyond the traditional media, what are the other outlets that we want to help push into. Who communicates in your community that's beyond the radio station or the newspaper, using Facebook groups, WhatsApp groups, et cetera, and how do we provide people with an absolutely clear way and easy technology to be able to distribute into those streams that people have. And one more slide. Actually, I'm gonna skip past this and we'll go to the next one. That's a list of kind of people we're talking about, but this is just one clear example. So like who is this? What does it actually look like when it goes on air? We're working with Reverend James Galliard, who was my colleague in the North Carolina House for 2 terms, but is not in the House anymore, but is the pastor of the largest Black church in Eastern North Carolina, and does all the TikTok stuff that you just heard about from Kate, is a very big public presence in his area, but is somebody that we want to turn into a statewide voice, because there's not really anybody that I've come across in North Carolina, maybe with the exception of Reverend Barber, who is able to really talk about where politics and faith and race intersect. And we think that he can be a powerful leadership voice for people who are really trying to figure that out, and to make sure that the left doesn't cede all of the ground around religion and race and politics to the right, who are so comfortable navigating that space. Next slide. So hopefully, if this works, we're able to have new ideas, we're able to have new leaders, we're able to mobilize communities that have been neglected. And then ultimately, if we're just providing a better civic infrastructure, we can increase voter turnout. The real key to us here is that this is a niche, and we understand that it is a very small niche and a small piece of what has to happen around both media infrastructure and how the left works as a whole. But it's a niche that we have completely neglected, and that the right has filled all of the space. And we believe that it's not that hard to go toe to toe with them. And in fact, it can be quite exciting as a possible way to develop new voices and new leaders. As I talked about this to one of our leading cable news people in North Carolina, he was excited because he said, that's exactly what I need. I need somebody who develops new voices that I can bring on to my shows, because I love to get people who aren't usually in the media bubble to come and talk to us about what they're doing, but that they have to have some practice before they can do TV. And so we see ourselves as the minor leagues, being able to get people ready for whatever the big things that come next, and creating a pipeline to get exciting new folks into the stream. I think we'll stop there, and we'll take more questions in the breakout room, and I'll look and see what you all have posted in the chat while I gave my spiel.
So I think now it's over to Julie to do a little bit of curating of maybe some of the questions in the chat.
Yeah, there's just a flood. Jim, you unleashed a flood of questions. The speakers have touched on so many issues. I don't know that any are clarifying type issues. They're all pretty big policy related. And I've noted some of them that I think, though I didn't get Greg, I'm sort of slipped on the last ones, but we're going to be opening up discussion rooms for each of the speakers, in which you can have, talk about the questions that have been posted to date or add new ones. But let me just sort of give a flavor of some of the ones that have come up. And as you try to sort out what you'd like to learn more about. Maybe this will sort of pique your interest. So on the topics of the National Trust for Local News, I think there's some skepticism that came through in several of the questions about how can this really survive? How can there be a profit in these rural areas with so few people? And, it just seems unsustainable. And isn't print sort of out of date? And, aren't people, just not, how can this all work? So, I think Fraser's discussion could touch on a lot of the details that she can relate. I mean, dollars and cents, this works. And she is an expert on this. She came from a long history of working in a Salt Lake City newspaper, and she knows all the angles. And this is, I think if you get more into the details with her, you will see this is a very pragmatic. Print journalism is alive and well in a community, and she'll tell you more about that. The questions that came up for Kate on the Courier content organization were just ranged across some that were like technical, like how can you do this when there's lots of areas where broadband doesn't work, to do people really want to touch on politics? Isn't this sort of the third rail for some of these influencers? Why do they want to get into this? What about those HBCUs that I think they came up in being mentions and oh wait, this was in Fraser's discussion, I think. Anyway, it was in one of those questions. So I think touching on the topic of diversity is something that really came out in these questions. And then one question that came up in regards to media deserts that I think would be an interesting one for Greg is why is the Southeast, why is it such a media desert? I think it's beyond North Carolina, but just more generally. That's what I captured to date. And so now we're going to shift into those, the breakout rooms. And if there are any questions that come up that are put into the chat that are not answered, I know that we'll be able to go back to all of these presenters and get more information from them after these presentations, if anybody wants to pursue them. So Mark, if you could show people.
Okay, we've opened the breakout rooms.
Are we set here? Should we start the session now?
Yeah.
Wonderful. So thanks to everyone for being here. I'm Esther Kaplan. I'm with Force Multiplier. If you don't know who we are an all-volunteer network of individual donors, mostly mid-level donors, who support research and identify House and Senate candidates who are in battleground states and districts who need to win in order for Democrats to hold the House and Senate. And we raise funds for those candidates. And we also support grassroots groups that are working in those same states and districts to register voters, educate voters, mobilize voters to turn out. So we were very pleased to support Courier Newsroom in the last cycle through the Rural Democracy Initiative, who are our wonderful partners. And we supported the whole range last cycle. And this cycle, we're specifically supporting the new newsroom in Nevada, because that's one of our battleground states, and we're proud to be helping to get it off the ground. So I'm a big fan of Courier Newsroom. I'm going to be just moderating the questions. And I'm going to start off with the ones that are in the chat, and we'll go from there. If you have another question, you can put the full question in the chat, or if you prefer, you can just put your name in the chat and I'll call on you and you can ask the question yourself. So Kate, nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
So there's a question. I'm going to start with Jim's question at the beginning. Do content organizers emphasize content that promotes progressive positions in particular?
We do, yes. So I think we would call it pro-democracy, but Courier Newsroom is really transparent because we do believe that journalism has to be transparent, that we are left of center, which means really for us that our reporters don't do a lot of what we consider to be both sidisms. We see this, I think, most in national media spaces where journalists who often feel like they've been painted into a corner by extremists on the right for being biased, go above and beyond to be what appears to be non-biased, and in doing so tend to elevate, folks who are sometimes close to fascists, as if their positions and voices deserve the same amount of play as like level-headed leaders who are working to actually serve communities. So we have a very basic sort of center core value system that all of our journalists operate on, which is we believe in democracy. We believe in promoting leaders and policies that help communities thrive, and that can be economic justice, racial justice, environmental justice. We believe things like climate change is real. We believe in bodily autonomy. We support LGBTQ+ rights, and so where those traditionally tend to be on the progressive value side. So what it looks like for content organizers is that they take the factual, localized and humanized stories that our journalists are creating, and they work to help sort of spread like a spider web, if you can think of it that way, that content to mission-aligned partners. We take feedback on the ground from the organizers and the organizations who are like deeply rooted in these local issues, and then we build out additional content, we share that back, and that helps organizations give information to both their volunteers, their owned audiences, and sometimes all the way down to their organizers on the doors. In Northern Michigan, we actually had a group that took video content door to door as part of their organizing program in 2022, because it was relevant and local and quick, and it was news, which just hits a little bit different than advocacy content does.
Right. So I'm going to add a question related to this, and that is, do you ever go negative? And if you do, what's your version of that?
Sure. We do believe in the power, I will say, of showing people when government works well. And, we understand that a lot of the mistrust and distrust in government comes from feeling like everything is a dumpster fire all of the time and that nothing you do is going to make a difference. So we try very hard to elevate the positive stories. That being said, we do have to hold people accountable in today's day and age. So what that looks like is accountability coverage for very specific people. And when we are very, very careful, our journalists do not center, I think one of the problems that we have seen in this country is that everyday Americans are put at the center as the fault problem. They are the folks who have created the political system that we are existing in, the hyperpartisan system, and all that does is fracture people and put them more in their corners. So we hold like an elected official accountable for the work that they are doing or not doing. We do also shed light on groups like Moms for Liberty, because if you are not paying close attention to politics and you are just living in a community and you see a moms group pop up that says that they are, protecting kids and educational freedom, you might not realize that there are a whole lot of bad actors and funders that are at play and at work here. And oftentimes some of those quote unquote moms might not even live in your community at all. So we do that kind of accountability coverage as well. Our organizers will share that as partners request, or if there is like a major crisis point that we do feel like has to have kind of the zone flooded with that information.
Yeah, so I think one example I've seen is, so for example, if a House member shows up at a ribbon cutting for an infrastructure project when in fact they did not fund the Infrastructure Act, you might let folks.
We might let people know, right? Because it is really hard to keep track of in today's, information overload society. Extremists have gotten very, very good at being able to take credit for the things that are popular policy, even when they actively fight to avoid them, and also to lay blame at the feet of folks when policies go away that were popular because of Republicans. I think the child tax credit will forever, for me, be a communication miss on the left side of things. Maybe the winning jobs narrative, if it had been fully deployed yet, we would have seen something different. But instead of just talking about lifting up poverty, being able to talk about the way it helped working class families make a difference. I know I was a recipient of the child tax credit as a single mom, and I can tell you that it made a tremendous difference in my life. But I was also working 2 jobs, so I didn't feel like it was a handout or even a hand up. I just felt like it was a essential program. Now, when that went away, we saw in local papers all over the place that state legislators were being blamed, that Democrats in office were being blamed, that it was budget bloat. So we really try to make sure people understand. And again, I'll just keep saying, like, the importance of connecting the dots between policy, policymaker, and everyday impact is really at the heart and center of the work that we're doing.
Hey, you just referenced, and Greg referenced it too, the winning jobs narrative. And I know that's an important, you're aligned with them. I'm thinking some people might not know what that is. Could you briefly?
Yeah, I am always happy to lift up Melissa Morales and the Somos Votantes team. They are phenomenal. If you have not had the opportunity to look up the Winning Jobs Narrative, I'll just plug them. You can do that at winningjobsnarrative.org. They have done a tremendous amount of research and testing and building for economic messaging that makes sense to everyday Americans and really centers the people over the sort of politicians or policies on high. This has been particularly effective and important in Latina communities. And we are working very closely with Somos Votantes in Nevada in our new newsroom, which is our first fully bilingual newsroom, which is very exciting, to really make sure that we are letting people know. And we do a lot of this actually in our content organizing in Nevada around the economy, letting people know, A, the resources that are available, but B, how those resources simply can play a collaborative partnership role in people's lives who are working very, very hard to make the ends meet on their own terms, not needing sort of a handout from the government, which is what a lot of communities in working class America feel like they are told they are doing when they take advantage of a program or a policy that's making an impact.
We're big fans of the Winning Jobs Narrative and want
They're the
everybody
best.
to know about it. Great.
Yes, we just had our whole team, our whole editorial team just had a refresher with Emmanuel from their team yesterday. So they're top of mind.
Okay, we have several questions about partnerships, and I think of it both in terms of the organizations you partner with and also the individuals. So let's start with the organizations. You mentioned Down Home North Carolina. We support them too.
Awesome.
And if you could talk about the kinds of organizations you partner with. There was a specific question, for example, about HBCUs. So maybe you could use that as
and actually,
Can I ask
think
a question? Can I ask?
Yeah.
Is this going to be open to questions from all of us, or this is just questions from?
No, I'm sorry, I mentioned at the beginning. I'm going down the questions that were already put in chat. And if you have more questions, either add them to the chat or just put your name in the chat and I see your hand up, or just do that and I'll call on you. So
Okay, thanks.
yeah, sure.
So I actually think that HBCU question was maybe for Fraser, but I'm happy to jump in and say that one of the things that we are working really hard to do in all of our states is to make sure that both our content is representative of everyone in all of the communities that we're serving, and also that we are reaching young people on college campuses in general. So in North Carolina, for example, we're building out an entire program working with youth-led organizations to have campus leaders become content creators in their own right in advance of 2024. And what that will really look like is a very clear focus on, how to vote as a student and why it matters. And so it'll be some fun content that you see on lots of, if you like me have college age kids, so you pay attention to college TikTok, you will see that a lot of college campuses already have social media students that are on doing sort of man on the street style interviews with folks. So we'll be doing a lot of that. And then we'll just be really leveraging some kind of civic education breakdowns and 101 on voting, because as we all know, not every state makes it super easy for college kids to vote, because when Gen Z votes, progressive values tend to win.
Great. Angie Lumpkin asked about individual personalities and how do you convince them to touch politics when they could get a backlash for doing so?
Yeah, that's a great question. So partly, we are really fortunate on the organizing team to have a group of young organizers who have been in the digital space for a couple of cycles. So they sort of know where to look to start. Honestly, that's part of it. Our community correspondents are folks who we love and we see as trusted messengers who are not comfortable talking about politics on their own channels or even on our channels as a correspondent, but they are supporters and believers in the same shared value system. So they lend their voices to bring people in to, like, Dogwood is a great example. We have a couple of stellar community correspondents who use their voice and their influence to actually get people to start to follow and pay attention to Dogwood. So they might not be the political messengers themselves, but they are helping draw in audiences for us so that we can then try and earn their trust and deliver political content. Now, that being said, we are fortunate that there is a growing number of young content creators who are interested in making a difference. We see with Gen Z that this is one of the most politically engaged generations. Certainly in my lifetime, I am just under 50, and I can say without a doubt that when they are armed with information, they are excited and enthusiastic about participating in their democracy. This is the generation who grew up with active shooter drills. They are the generation that are seeing in real time impacts of climate change. They are the generation that is facing, insurmountable debt when they get out of college, and also just inflation rates and jobs not matching inflation rates, not matching just the cost of living, so that they understand the importance of having a voice. And when we find those people, we really do, it's like hand-to-hand combat. We reach out, we start building a relationship, and then we invite them in to be part of our program. We do also collaborate. There are a couple of exciting organizations that are just dedicated to finding these influencers that are starting to spring up. Vocal Media is one, Social Current is another. These are partners that we collaborate with on a pretty regular basis to help us find folks in our states if we're having trouble doing so. And then just to touch really quickly on partnerships, anyone and everyone who shares our values are people that fall into our partnership sphere. So I'll kind of talk from the national level to the hyper-local level very quickly. We have partners like Vote Save America, which is, obviously the Crooked Media team that helps work to build grassroots activation across the country. So we will provide source material for them as we go into 2024 for their state-based programs. We work very, very closely with Center for American Progress that builds out story banks of personal stories and people willing to uplift how something like an infrastructure bill can actually impact a person, not even just a community. And we are able to leverage that so that our reporters have those hyper-local and humanized stories to tell. At the state level, we'll work with organizations that you all are familiar with, Planned Parenthood, advocates of any given state, LCV, the union groups, all of the folks who are like active practitioners of doing the work on the ground in a state. And then we work really hyper local too. We will work with indivisible groups at a county level. We will work with county Dem parties. We will work with high school student groups that want to help spread information to their community about the importance of their local school board race. So we really are able to kind of partner with anyone who's looking to help learn how to spread information that is high quality, factual, and truthful to their audiences, or also just needs content to spread to their teams.
Great, thank you. George Wyeth noted that many rural areas still lack broadband. And so how are you reaching those folks?
Yeah, that is really true. So this is where, I continue to lift up work like what is Fraser's doing. There are spaces that, internet is still not stable enough that it is the primary source of news. For us and our target audience, we really do stay in the digital lane as much as possible. So we understand that in more rural places, the best folks to reach might actually be the young people, because most of them do have cell phones. And if they have cell phones and they have coverage for their cell phones, they are able to use data to be scrolling through TikTok. So those are the places that we see. We actually see a lot of this in North Carolina. Our coverage of the abortion ban earlier this year in North Carolina blew up on TikTok and had over 1 million views in 24 hours, had tons of young people reaching out, asking what they could do, asking how to find out information. And they were from really far-flung places in North Carolina. And that was great because we were also able to kind of lift up the work that Andy is doing at the NC Dems, really focusing on rural communities and focusing on rural youth and getting engagement going. And so we were able to also kind of present content from her. And we know from sort of back channel conversations that there was a lot of connections made through that work. So.
Great. Thank you. Deborah, I think you're next.
Thanks, Esther. Thanks, Kate. So Kate, you can see the demographic on the screen.
So we can see demographics on the back end. Yes.
Okay, wait. No, so I'm just saying, as far as kind of people who
yes,
do the kind of work, do the kind of social.
Yes, I got you. Okay.
Right. I mean, so, we're interested in participating, but I guess I have two questions. One is, how much do you see our demographic, older people who vote? I mean, there's those young people and there's the older, and you can always count on us. How do you see this, kind of this effort connecting with this demographic, which is a really good voting demographic? And the other side is kind of, and then we're fairly social media shy. I mean, we're not influencers. We're not in the middle of this. We really should be in the middle of this. How do you see those?
I love this question. And I will tell you, I love this question because I spent 22 years as a news editor, but then 6 prior to joining Courier as a rural political strategist and an organizer. So I like to tell people news can be like a digital yard sign or a postcard. And this age demographic is actually the bread and butter of our Facebook relational sharing programs. So, like anyone, I think kind of my age and up uses Facebook primarily as the social media trend. I am really sorry if some of you are excellent TikTokers. I am a consumer, but definitely not a participant, minus a few really bad dance videos that my 15-year-old forced upon me once upon a time. I think, Deborah, what I have seen huge success with is when we have like local grassroots groups that will bring one of our organizers in for a training to talk about how to use news as sort of a relational way to have a conversation on social media without it having to be activist content, without having to be a content creator yourself, and by leveraging sort of, state politics often as a way to just share information about a policy. So like we are able to move content relationally in communities in ways that we find really effective. And I didn't say this on the call because a lot of you I think we're in a call with Tara, our founder, but we do a lot of experiments on our work. So we look to see if we are actually moving the needle on civic engagement after election cycles. And we find the more people see the content, the more we are able to show statistically significant impact. So I think that folks like this that are on this call, if you have a Facebook account, if you have a local grassroots group that you're part of, if you ever want an organizer to come talk about how to fight disinformation by sharing good information online, just sharing news content that connects the dots for people, even if you're not having a conversation about it, you are a trusted messenger in your community. So you are a trusted messenger in your own sort of Facebook ecosystem. People will see it that might not otherwise see it because you've posted it. And as they're scrolling, they see your news content.
Great. Thank you. Angie, I see your hand up.
Yes. Well, to Deborah's point, because you all hit the nail on the head. I get very active locally, but I have basically gone off Facebook, or I never post anymore because it has caused such rifts in my personal community. And yet I work with young people. So I'm all about, hey, come on, guys, get the TikToks out, get out the Instagram. But I know that they're grasping a lot of time because they don't feel seasoned. They feel like, I don't really know what's going on. So Kate, like if you give me an example, just like steps to and what we could do if we were going to try to get you into train or make a connection. I've been really active in the redistricting issues right now, which of course is being voted on today, which is horrendous, which is
Yes.
basically going to invalidate a lot of our get out of vote, things when they've basically done that. And that is such a complicated issue that I don't even know how to get that out. Like I had to craft my own response to the General Assembly. It took me hours. I threw that up as a template for all my friends on email. But even then, out of like maybe 20 people, if I contacted them, I had hopes that maybe only 2 would follow through because it was complicated.
Yes, redistricting is the worst thing to have a conversation about. I think out of almost any issue happening in politics right now, because it is really complicated and complex. Our Cardinal and Pine correspondent just actually put up a video, I think yesterday, trying to break it down like a basketball game between UNC and Duke, and trying to like simplify in a way that, folks on TikTok might grasp, understand, or even want to pause and listen to, because redistricting is also at its core, it feels boring, for lack of a better word, for a lot of people, and young people in particular, because there's a lot of moving parts. So I think to answer your question, yes, we do talk to schools, and we do wisely tailor our conversations with schools to civic education, period, and the opportunity we have to share. But I'm happy to connect or have Julie connect us after if you want to talk about ways that we could give you guys kind of step-by-steps, or even if you wanted something in writing like a toolkit to help young people feel more empowered to engage, share, create content on their own.
So it sounds like partly what you're saying is if we looked at the long game, it is better to do small bites where they can have a positive return on their
experience, positive return, feel engaged and empowered. I mean, I think we all know that, right? Like if you have ever knocked a door, you know that one really great interaction will like push you to go again, even if you had 10 really tough interactions. So I think in general, yes, small bites.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great.
And the breakout rooms are closing and people are coming back to this discussion.
Well, thank you
general group
all.
now.
Thank you, Kate. That was terrific.
No, thank you. It was really fun.
Well, welcome back. We're just going to have a few concluding words now. I'm going to put up some takeaways on some slides, and then we are going to have discussion of one action step that actually connects a little bit more to our April presentation when Tara McGowan and Dan Pfeiffer laid out a big picture of the MAGA media and how to fight it. So we're going to, but this is all connected. So let me pull up slides for a few concluding thoughts. Okay, so going back to Dan, this is one of Dan's best statements. I just think of it all the time. Democrats spend 99% of their time worrying about what they should say, and only 1% figuring out how to get people to hear what they are saying. Now, he wrote that in a book that came out a year ago. And so he wrote it a little bit before that, and he's thought it for a long time. And I think things are changing. Look at what we've talked about today. We are not focusing on messaging, though that has been implicit in the discussion. We're talking about getting the word out and making sure that the word doesn't die in news deserts. So next slide. So we've talked about 3 media outlets of different, well, or overseers or operators of media outlets today. And I think they would meet with Dan's approval, but they are not alone. So I made a list of just 3 others that I want to mention. And in the follow-up email that, if we can go back, in the follow-up email that you'll get as soon as the YouTube of this recording of this presentation is put together by the wonderful Jim Coates, a 31st Street member who donates his time to create those YouTubes. As soon as that's ready, I'm going to put it in an email, the link to you. And that email is also going to contain a link that will take you to other startups in this sort of genre, this family. So a couple, Civic Media, 17 local radio stations in Wisconsin that are trying to reclaim radio from the talk radio of the far right. The Latino Media Network, this is brand new, 18 radio stations in 10 cities. A few may not be quite as in the vein of honest media as we'd like, but most will be, we think. And Capital B News, which is a Black-led, nonprofit, local and national news organization. I've been reading their Atlanta outlet, and it's just a very interesting perspective on things like Cop City. Next. What's still too scarce? We need more. And we can help just by knowing more about this area and the importance of new media outlets, because right now billionaires are pumping a lot of money into media that promotes lies, and the return on investment is very great. So we need to provide more commercial and nonprofit outlets that are flooding the zone with good information, and we need to do our part as well. Next slide. So, as a more concrete call to action, and as I said, it sort of ties more to our April program, where we talked about getting louder. I want to welcome Jill Purdy of NOPE, which is a grassroots organization also here in the Metro DC area. That's a sister organization to 31st Street, and it is co-sponsor of this program, along with many other groups that you saw. And she's going to discuss a program for us to get louder that will launch in mid-November after the Virginia elections and all the work we're doing on that. So Jill, tell us more.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. And we are just getting our feet on the ground. I think there's a slide and developing a program. First is to recognize the population that are members of NOPE and what they're doing right now on social media and sharing messaging and sharing content. So we are kicking off our program November 12th at our meeting there with a speaker on democratic strategies. And one of those strategies is getting louder for democracy. At that point, we will be recruiting members. We will identify what media platforms they're currently using. We have found an excellent program, excellent training at the DNC Social Ambassadors site, but I've learned today of additional potential training for them. And we will offer training after we identify the people. And then, as I have found from a little bit of testing, we will need to provide ongoing support and communication so that we support these people when they get the responses from sharing on social media. And we'll work through improving the program, finding the best sources of content, and additional ways to roll out the program and make it larger as we go. Any questions? We welcome.
Jill, just so you know, the link that is in the chat to sign up for the meeting, right? And I will also include that in the follow-up email to people.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Julie. Appreciate it.
So that concludes our program. Thank you very, very much for coming. And we look forward to joining us for we're going to continue with these programs. And we look forward to seeing you again.